Okay, hi chat. Welcome to your third ever session of Box Talks, and today we'll be talking about the wonderful, the ever depressing, but also very intriguing film noir. So, as per usual, again, the foreword. There's a lot to cover about. There's a lot to cover about. Smooth. There's a lot to cover and talk about. It is a shorter time frame, yes, but it's pretty dense in regards to the content that I'm covering this time around. Societal and creative factors, and of course, film noirs themselves. And this whole debate about genre and style, which is an entire monster that I've tried to compress down to a digestible level for everyone here. Yes, we will be talking about this later on in the Box Talks, do not worry. I will be covering a lot more films here, except as much as I want to go into depth about every single film that I do cover, those are like 2 to 3 hour films, and if I did cover them in detail, we would be here forever, so as such, the films covered here will only be a quick summary. Because again, I will talk about a lot of films here. So if any of them catch your fancy in any way, shape, or form, please watch them. All the films that I will talk about will have their year and director, I believe. So at best, at minimum, they will have their year and the title. So if you find any of them interesting, you can watch them in your own time period. Or we could do movie nights. I'll see about that if we have enough people who want that. But for now, please dig into this topic more if you're interested. I am only one box being. I am not a professional by any means. I am just someone who really likes film history and has studied film history and wants to impart the knowledge upon me. So yeah, please. I just hope that this, like all my other box talks, are a stepping stone for you to dig into the wonderful and confusing but very fun world of film history. So on that note, what on earth are we covering? Well, obviously, since we're covering a film movement, genre, style thing, we're going to be talking about influences. Yes, we are covering German Expressionism again, but I promise it will be brief. We're not going to dedicate half of it. We're not going to have like an entire mini box talks about this. We're covering it very briefly. Don't worry. We're also going to be covering the Great Depression because the film noir that we're covering, the time period of classic film noir, falls during this time frame, and understanding the Great Depression helps us understand why film noir grew and why film noir became as recognizable and as famous as it was. And again, it reflects society. So keep that in mind. So keep the Great Depression in mind when I eventually talk about, or when we eventually go into what makes a film noir. Which of course leads to the cinema in the Great Depression and how on earth cinema managed to stay afloat during this time of great economic instability and, for lack of a better term, prosperity. And after that, we'll cover film noir's history. We're talking about proto-noirs, aka films that helped shape noir in some way, shape, or form. These are not specifically film noirs in themselves, hence the name proto-noir. We're probably gonna be focusing film noir we're gonna be primarily focusing on film noir's classic period, which is the 40s and 50s, and then we'll be talking about film noir's place, air quotes, to this whole genre versus style debate that I mentioned in the earlier slide, which is an entire mess. I'll keep saying that it is a mess because it still haunts me to this day. But also, in regards to film noir's place, we will be talking about the characteristics of film noir. Again, this whole debate of genre versus style, and then essentially film noir's legacy, which is through neo-noirs. So, starting with everyone's favorite movement, German Expressionism. Again, but I promise it's gonna be very brief. As a film historian, I'm contractually obliged to start with German Expressionism. Yes, I know it feels like we're beating a dead horse, but that's just how important this movement was to anything and everything about film. Thankfully, we'll be covering only we'll only be covering this for a very brief moment. So, what aspects carried over to film noir from German Expressionism? Well, a lot. A majority of German Expressionism found its way into film noir because of, well, through its dark, moody tones, its chiaroscuro lighting, and of course the themes that were prevalent within German Expressionism. If you're familiar with the first box talks, I talked about it there. Themes surrounding paranoia, anxiety, and everything that Germany was feeling at the time, you will see mirrored within film noir. And of course, the lighting, the chiaroscuro lighting. I'm sorry, Italians, I keep butchering this. But the use of extreme shadows and to make stark contrast between characters and the world is what makes film noir, right? And also, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, very famous. I've talked about these before in detail, but it just goes to show you that the themes found within these two films, of course, like as I mentioned before, the anxieties surrounding anxieties in German society at the time of like post World War I Germany and Germany's transition into the Nazi Party at the time is reflected within these films. But also, remember that expressionist directors fled. That's a oopsie, chat. That I didn't say. I didn't mean to say expressionist directors fled to Germany. I meant to say expressionist directors fled from Germany, and they found their way into America, as I mentioned before. It was in response to, of course, the growing Nazi power in Germany, and since most of the directors fled to America, they wound up working in American productions, and their influence would be found in early Hollywood, as I mentioned within an earlier box talks, Frankenstein and Dracula. Those had German expressionist influences. Those films not only had a German expressionist influence, but they also had actual individuals who were part of the German expressionist movement. So, audit. Okay, we're having some technical difficulties here. Hooray. There we go. So, with that in mind, now that we've covered German expressionism, let's move to a key period for America, and one that'll help us understand the formation of film noir, which is, of course, the Great Depression. Lasting between 1929 to 1939, this economic low point was preceded by the highs that was the Roaring Twenties. As for the Roaring Twenties, this was a period of major economic prosperity for the United States, where the country is experiencing massive boom as it smoothly shifted from a wartime economy from World War I to one of peace. New technology, new goods, you name it, it was probably experiencing growth at that time. Now, in response to this major economic boom, a majority of American money was invested in stocks. There was high hopes that such investments would pay off in the long term. Everything was great, right? During this time, everything was great, everything was amazing. Surely nothing could go wrong. Like, it would be an utter shame if something happened that would upturn America's economy, right? And then the Wall Street crash of 1929 happened. So, let's talk about that. The Great Depression, the crash of 1929, led to high rates in unemployment and poverty, so much so that nobody was safe from it. Countless American banks experienced failure, and it was because of their belief in the gold standard, which in turn led to unregulated lending procedures, otherwise known as laissez-faire. Pardon my French. It meant that many accrued high debts that they simply couldn't pay, and if the customers couldn't pay back their debts, that meant the money supply was low. And if the money supply was low, the banks would have to, well, end up liquidating their assets. And then by 1933, more than 9,000 banks closed their doors. And because of these bank closures, many saw this as a threat. Many average Americans saw this as a threat, and which of course led to many people panicking and requesting withdrawals from the bank, and basically any bank. And because there were so many withdrawals happening at this time in response to the crash and many other banks experiencing failures, America's system couldn't handle the withdrawals, the massive amount of withdrawals happening at this time, and in turn, they lost about 20% of the total 6.8 billion withdrawn during this panic. So, now that we know the state of the economy and how the state of the economy was, it really didn't incentivize any spending upon the average American, and that was perfectly understandable. Though this brings up a question. What on earth did Americans do for entertainment? Because entertainment was hard to come by. You couldn't really be entertained if you couldn't afford to go to the entertainment in the first place. It was hard to come by at a reasonable price, but that wasn't to say that there was no options. There were options. There were specific options, to be exact, such as radio, music, sports, and cinema. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? This whole idea of cinema being able to thrive in a state of economic disparity and a state of economic low. Well, funny I mention that because cinema being cheap in a time where the country's economic situation was less than ideal wasn't exclusive to post-war Germany. America had it too. And it turns out cinema was one of the few affordable options during the Great Depression. However, this was not to say that the industry in America went unscathed. The industry did suffer. Focus shifted from luxury movie palaces to neighborhood cinemas. Production costs were cut, and crew salaries were also cut in the process. And of course, because of the state of America's economy at the time, a number of theaters across the US closed, and films began to reflect the country's dreary and rather dire social climate at the time. The remaining theaters, the ones that weren't closed, needed a way to bring in audiences to keep their income in some way, shape, or form. So how did they do this exactly? Remember, you can't stay open if you don't have an audience. Remember, at the end of the day, theater, cinema, is still a business. They needed money. They needed the cash flow, right? So how did they get that? Well, they got that through a wonderful thing called lowering admission prices. It's the obvious answer, but they had not only did theaters lower admission prices, they also had double features, which is essentially two for the price of one. You pay for one ticket and you get to see two feature films, but also more curious options such as dish night and bank nights. What exactly were dish nights and bank nights? Think of it as you go to the theater and then you have a chance, of course after you buy a ticket, you have a chance to get free dishware or a cash prize. This was just done to incentivize anyone to spend their money to come into the theaters. And as strange as it was to hear like the average American at the time going to a theater to possibly have the chance of getting free plates, dishes, or even money, it worked. These things worked. And of course, there was also the possible giveaway of food, although from what I've seen, this was a less common occurrence as well. And yes, Free giveaways, like giveaways for going to the film, sounds weird now, but it worked back in the day. All these worked. And not only that, Americans needed a way to escape the stresses of daily life and living in the Great Depression. So theaters provided one such avenue of escape, which begs the question, how on earth did theaters get their films? Well, good thing I get to talk about block booking. So what exactly is this mystical technique of block booking? Well, this was the act of selling multiple films as a set or a unit to theaters. If you were an aspiring theater owner wanting to exhibit the next hit film, you couldn't buy only that film. You had to buy a unit from a studio. And the worst part about this was that purchases were often done without the knowledge of what other films were. So essentially you were buying blind, and I'll cover this later, very soon. So, oh yeah, and furthermore, as you were buying these units, some of these films weren't even in production yet. You were paying to buy a film that hasn't either left the writing room or hasn't even started production yet. And again, these were bought blindly with no knowledge about the full plot or whatever it showed on screen, despite what little info they had from the films via what actors are starring in the picture or a brief synopsis from the distributors themselves. And this started as early as the silent era, though block booking would become prevalent with the introduction of sound films in the 1920s. And this would be the main marketing practice for studios until U.S. vs. Paramount Pictures Inc. in 1948 said that this act of block booking was unlawful. This is essentially an anti-oligopoly. Studios could essentially no longer own theaters. So, given that block booking was essentially a bundle of films, many studios would ship quotes B pictures with A pictures. And if A pictures sound vaguely familiar, it's because they're what we call A-list films today. These were high-profile and big-budget films that often drew in audiences. These were what exhibitors were primarily paying for. Now, B movies or B pictures, as we know them, were low-budget films that were easily produced. These were packaged alongside A movies / A-list films to ensure studios could at least make a profit from the block booking process, right? So again, you wanted to buy a specific A-list film, but under block booking, you had to buy all these other B movies as well. And you wouldn't know what these other movies were until you got them. And again, some of them weren't even in production by the time you bought them. So, putting this into modern context, say you wanted the ability to show Schindler's List from Universal Pictures. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. You could buy, and you would buy the ability to exhibit this at your theater, but you'd also have to purchase Tremors as well. That's what block booking was back in the day, and the kinds of films that were involved in this process. Of course, that meant there are far more B movies than A movies in these bundles. So, where did directors get their new material for these films? Well, we turn to pulp magazines. Also known as the pulps, these were introduced in the late 1890s all the way to the mid 1950s, derived from the word wood, pulp paper that made these magazines up. These were America's versions of the penny dreadfuls found in England, and they reached their peak within the 1920s to the 1940s. Much like cinema, this was another alternative option to get cheap and easy entertainment during the Great Depression. Some examples, of course, were adventure, fantasy, espionage, horror, romance. The list continues. If there was a genre you could think of, it was likely available as a pulp magazine. But there is one that I'd like to specifically focus on for this session, and that would be The Black Mask. First published in April 1920, this is a magazine focused on mystery fiction and would later become known for creating the hard-boiled crime subgenre. Hard-boiled crime is known for their anti-hero detectives, corrupt settings, and overall cynical presentation in their stories. The Black Mask featured many notable authors that would be known for their crime literature, and some of these stories would inevitably be adapted into film noirs themselves. And I'll cover some of those in the next slide, starting with Maltese Falcon, written by Dashiell Hammett. Dashiell Hammett, sorry, I had to explode a bot. Written in 1930, adapted in 1931 and 1941. And you might notice, why were there two adaptations of Maltese Falcon? Well, there's a reason for that, and I'll cover it later. Bonus points if you know why. I've talked about it before in an earlier box talks, but moving on from Maltese Falcon, we have also The Glass Key, which was also written in 1930 and adapted in 1935 and 1942. Why was it adapted twice? It's probably the same reason for Maltese Falcon, and if you know why, bonus points if you do, but if you don't worry, I'll cover it. It's a plague upon this time period, I'll say that much. And of course, Double Indemnity, written by James N. Cain, gets a special mention because this is a film we will be covering later on. Written in 1943, adapted in 1944, and is largely considered one of the key films of film noir's classic period. James N. Cain also wrote The Postman Always Rings Twice, written in 1934 and adapted in 1946, and this was also a part of film noir's classic period. And then Raymond Chandler, writer of The Big Sleep, which was of course adapted in 1946 and written in 1939, has a unique space. Chandler has a unique space because not only did he have one of his novels turn into a film noir itself, he actually wrote the script for Double Indemnity, which is James M. Cain's novel, but also wrote the script for Blue Dahlia and Strangers on a Train. So, with Chandler, we see that authors moved from magazines into the cinema space, along with many others, and of course, these are just a handful of examples from Black Mask and other pulp magazines that got adapted into film noirs as a whole. So, now that we've covered essentially the history or factors leading up to film noir, let's talk about film noir and what on earth that means. I've been using the term film noir ever since we started, but I've never really explained how this term came to be, so let's fix that before we go into further detail about this topic. So, where on earth did we get this term? Well, it came from, film noir translates into black film or dark film, and this was coined by a French critic called by the name of Nina Frank in 1946. So this is why, despite film noir being primarily an American film style genre thingamadoobab, I'm gonna call it thingamadoobab until we get to that genre style debate slide later on. This is how we got its very French name, because a French critic gave it to us, or rather, French gave it to America at the time. However, the term film noir wasn't really recognized by film professionals at the time, and actually it would be adopted in 1970s. It was retroactively given to films that fell into this definition of film noir. And before film noir became a thing and was used as a term to describe these films, most of the noir films we consider as film noirs were considered melodramas. So, now we've talked about how the term film noir came to be, let's dial it back slightly and talk about proto-noirs. So, I'll be covering a few films, a handful of films here for proto-noirs, as you'll see here with this very first slide. Think of these as early influences before film noir came into their own. So, starting way back in 1931 with Fritz Lang's M, yes. This is another German expressionist film. I'm sorry. You cannot escape German expressionism, okay? But I promise this film is actually very important. This is actually classified as a mystery thriller film, and not a crime film, not a horror film, specifically a mystery thriller film. And it's this film, M, is very important to understand film noir as a whole. This is perhaps the closest noir film within German expressionism, but also perhaps the earliest instance of a film noir, air quotes, film noir, within film history, featuring a dreary urban setting with a crime-centric story. There's a killer on the loose, and said killer is the subject of a manhunt where their crimes affect everyone in the city, even other criminals. And unlike future noirs, though, M features a happy ending, or rather a proper resolution. The killer is caught and justice is found. And as we see with some wonderful skills that I got from watching from M, you can kind of see the influences, or rather key characteristics of film noir slowly come into focus here. We have dark shadows, we have crime, we have urban settings, we have this wonderful top-down angle here. In the bottom middle, my mouse is over it. But this is a beautiful shot, and the shot to the left here is actually, we see the character's reflection within the glass, and that is something that film noir does take. Film noir will use strange angles, and I'll cover this in more in detail later on, but film noir is not shy from using weird angles, weird camera tricks to manipulate perspective, and things like that. And of course, how could I forget chiaroscuro lighting, sharp contrasts, using outlines of shadowed figures, all that wonderful thing. All of those wonderful aspects. Urban environments, you got it. Crime, you have it. More crime, you have it. Seedy underworld spaces, you have it. It's here. It's here, it's present. And speaking of crime, let's talk about Scarface. Not the Scarface from 1983 with Tony. No, this is the 1932 one, directed by Howard Hanks. Now, this is a gangster film. Now, Hazel, why did you put a gangster film here as a proto-noir film? Well, this is one of the first, or this was and is a very successful crime film, a very successful gangster film, and its success brought crime to the forefront. Audiences wanted this gritty, this messy urban settings, and Scarface showed that. Its success showed that audiences cared, or were rather invested in this story about crime and criminal protagonists with messy, dirty backgrounds. And they were eager to watch these films. And not only did they love these stories, it also helped push morally questionable protagonists, tragic endings, and a whole list of other things that we get to see with perhaps the first, air quotes, proper proto-noir to come out. Fritz Lang's You Only Live Once. Yes, this is directed by Fritz Lang. German Expressionism's roots run deep within this one as well. So, what is You Only Live Once? Well, this was the first true proto-noir. M was not a proto-noir. Scarface was not a proto-noir. This, however, is considered the first proto-noir film produced. And even though it was widely considered as the first proto-noir, It bombed at the box office. As sad as that is, this is actually an aspect of film noirs that is more relevant than you think. Surprisingly. So keep this little tidbit of info in mind. So, it stars Henry Fonda as an ex-convict. Now, Henry Fonda is a famous US actor, but for this, we are going to be talking about Henry Fonda, the character Henry Fonda plays. The character he plays is ex-convict Eddie Taylor, and shows some aspects that would become standard within film noir. Namely, they're a protagonist that gets involved in crime, and with Taylor's case in the film, unwillingly. They're also a vehicle to show how corrupt society is, since Fonda's character is the audience's perspective into the film's world and how the system pushes back against an ex-criminal. And they often carry a very pessimistic view about society. Keep these characteristics in mind as we continue onwards as well. And like most protagonists in film noir, they die at the end. As punishment for their actions, whether they're involved willingly or unwillingly. And now, I'd be remiss not to talk about Citizen Kane, okay? I'd be remiss not to talk about Citizen Kane, chat. This is one more proto-noir, and I'm not even sure I could call it a proto-noir, but I feel like I wouldn't be doing myself justice. Not only myself, but also like my standing as a film historian VTuber if I didn't talk about Citizen Kane, okay? It's if I did, I feel like it'd be a crime, pun, if I didn't mention it, you know? So, Citizen Kane, Orson Welles, released in 1941. This, again, is not a noir film. This is not a noir film. This is not a proto-noir film. However, many noirs take inspiration from this drama pseudo-biopic. And as you'll see, has many aspects that we find in a film noir. Flashbacks, MacGuffins, corruption in some way, shape, or form, investigations, you list it, Citizen Kane probably has it. And speaking of Citizen Kane, goodness gracious, am I being a bit too excited talking about Orson Welles and his masterful camera work? Yes, but you have to understand that these shots, these shots are amazing. These shots are beautiful. We have chiaroscuro lighting. We have these framings, the framing, the camera work. I'm sorry. I'm getting a bit too excited. But Wells's camera work here could, if you didn't know better, if you didn't know better, I could pass these off as film noir shots to some degree. I could say that, hey, some of these shots from Citizen Kane could very well be a noir film, and it shows through the heavy use of shadows or chiaroscuro lighting, as I've mentioned to death. It does so much to create the mood, this aura of mystique and grandeur and mystery. It captivates you. I'm trying to find the proper words, and the words that I have on my notes are failing me from how beautiful these shots are. Citizen Kane is such a good film, okay? I know we're here to talk about film noir, but I'm taking a small chunk out of my discussion to talk about Citizen Kane, okay? Okay? Okay, smile. Good. Please. Mind you, Citizen Kane was released in 1941. Around the start of, as we'll cover very soon, film noir's classic period. So, Citizen Kane, for a bit more context on Citizen Kane, which I didn't mention in these slides, is that this was a very well-received film this did amazing. This did amazing. A lot of people today consider Citizen Kane as one of the must-watch films. If you ask someone, hey, what films should I watch? Citizen Kane will be one of them. So mind you, if we pull it back a bit to like 1941, Citizen Kane releases. It made waves for its camera techniques, its cinematic techniques. It essentially elevated the art of cinema to a higher standard. And many films afterwards, not just film noirs, would follow it. And even through these shots, you'll see characteristics that are found within film noirs. So, yes, Citizen Kane is not a noir film, but its success and its groundbreaking aesthetics at the time will find its way into a noir one way or another. So keep this in mind. Just keep all the proto-noirs in mind as we talk about film noir's classic period. Now, what exactly is the classic period for film noirs? Well, this lasted from the 1940s to the 1950s. And while there's plenty of noirs that I could cover, for the sake of time and my own sanity and yours, I'll cover only 3, air quotes, key films that from this time period. That is not to say that there are other famous film noirs from this era that are lesser than these featured films. No. They all contribute to the identity of film noir. It's just that, again, I can't cover them all, and I want to give you all a general overview. If I had to tell you which 3 classic period film noirs, try saying that 3 times fast, to watch, I would say to go to these 3 first. There's a lot of debate on which film noirs are the best, but for the sake of this, I'm just gonna give you these. That is not to say that there is bad or lesser film noirs that are within this time period. No, there are plenty of film noirs that many consider are really good or even the best within this time period. So keep that in mind. I'm just giving you 3 for the sake of general overview and stepping stones if you want to chase this rabbit hole even deeper. So let's start with Stranger on the Third Floor. Directed by Boris Inkster, this B movie lost a third of its total production cost, and that was it was due to this box office flop that many didn't consider this film as the beginning of film noir proper. Though this would later change, with many citing it as the first of its kind, and rightfully so. Stranger on the Third Floor set the groundwork for many of film noir's key characteristics. Of course, as I've mentioned before, many film noirs rely on urban settings, heavy shadows, and narration. We're talking first-person narration while the character does stuff. And of course, the protagonist is often involved with crime, and in this case, they're trying to find the truth. So, with Stranger on the Third Floor, our lovely news reporter, whose name I forgot, is trying to find the true culprit of a crime because he believes he indicted someone else, if I remember correctly. I should have bought notes on this. So as we see with these shots, right? Yes, to think it was a B movie to set it off, yes. Again, a majority of film noirs were B movies. Keep that in mind. But yes, this Stranger on the Third Floor is considered the first noir of the time, and as we see here, we can see the early formations of the film noir style or visual look. We see very stark shadows, the urban settings, highly populated for the time urban settings. A lot of extras were prevalent in these films back in the day. A lot of use of crowds as well from these 2 shots, but also, again, shadows. People in the shadows, people partially covered in shadows, mostly covered in shadows. And of course, the iconic suit and trilby look, and that was just product of the time. That was just the product at the time, but the fashion really helped. The fashion really helped, and a lot of people, and it's such a subtle thing. The fashion at the time helped push the iconic look of film noir characters, and it's something that I don't think a lot of people recognize. So keep in mind, or try to imagine early 1940s, early 1950s fashion, and understand that, hey, this kind of fashion was what was seen on screen and what was eventually folded into film noir as a whole. And of course, since this was directed by a German Expressionism director, there had to be some German Expressionism influences. And this is actually shown in the trials sequence of this film. And for those familiar with German Expressionism, and for those familiar with my first box talks, you can clearly see the grandiose German Expressionism on full display here. These shots are just essentially a modern interpretation of what German Expressionism could be, and it's clear to see. It's clear to see here. Grandiose settings, almost, how do I put this? Almost unnatural lighting patterns in the background. Strange angles, the lighting here as well in the middle pictures and the first three pictures over here do so much, because again, they adhere to this idea of eschewing traditional aesthetics at the time of German Expressionism. So you see a lot of jagged shapes, strange angles, even unnatural proportions. This is not a natural, obviously, this is not a natural courtroom. Everything's off skew, off kilter, everything's disproportionate, and that's just to enforce this idea of German Expressionism. And of course, you know, since it's Fritz Lang, there has to be, he pulls his German Expressionism influence to this wonderful dream sequence, which I wish I could show on stream, but alas, I cannot, because copyright is scary. So, with that said, let's move on to Double Indemnity, which was mentioned briefly in an earlier slide. This film was directed by Billy Wilder and was adapted from Paul Kane's novel. This starred Fred MacMurray and Barbara Stanwyck. And this film would be transformative for these two actors because Stanwyck's character became the standard for femme fatales going forward. What are femme fatales? Essentially, we'll cover those, and we'll actually cover those in a later slide, I believe. And MacMurray himself was broke from typecasting with Double Indemnity. He was typically typecasted as the nice guy in many films before this one, but because of his acting and also the film's success, he managed to break away from this and would find roles that would match the cynicism found within many film noirs. Double Indemnity set the standard, or rather the standard, for film noir tropes and characteristics going forward, essentially building off Stranger on the Third Floor. So, let's talk about characters. MacMurray and Stanwyck's characters are both morally deplorable, simply put. They're Walter Neff, played by MacMurray, conspires with Phyllis Dietrichson, names are hard, Stanwyck, to commit life insurance fraud by murdering Dietrichson's husband. Unfortunately, or fortunately depending on how you look at it, both get punished, with Neff being apprehended and Dietrichson being killed. Their schemes draw the eye of an investigator, specifically claims manager named Barton Keyes, played by Edward G. Robertson. Keyes specifically is our lens in which the story is told through a flashback with him following the breadcrumbs of the duo's crime. The story unfolds over time with more and more info being revealed as the investigation continues until it reaches the present. And of course, Double Indemnity pushes the noir aesthetic even further to the forefront. We have the iconic and equally stereotypical dark, moody detective office. in these shots. You have the open blinds slowly letting light in the picture that I'm partially covering up behind me, but also the standard smoker, the standard smoking detective. The aesthetic is there, right? The aesthetic is there. We have the dense urban environment, the cars passing by. We have the dimly lit offices. We have the main male lead in a rather snazzy suit, and then we have the femme fatale, Stanwyck's character, femme fatale, which we will cover again later. What exactly is a femme fatale? But even more so here, just more of these iconic film noir characteristics coming just present within this film. We have more office shots, of course. The crime, a lot of smoking as well, yes. And of course, just more of this interplay of light and shadow. Chiaroscuro lighting. Here, especially with this one, the one my mouse is on. Here, we have this wonderful shot. Just McMurray at night. And again, we'll cover this. We will cover why it's this dark. There is a very, very neat thing that film noirs do, practically on the physical end. But yes, not only did they rely on stark lighting from actual lights, they sometimes relied on actual lighting or lack thereof. And we will cover that in a future slide. And again, more interplay of light and shadow. Stanwyck's character, covered in shadow. McMurray's lit by the flame. Stanwyck hiding behind the door frame. Covered, essentially blocked off. This covers half of the door frame, separates half the screen, which is a great shot. This is a really good shot, actually. But we see here just the reinforcement of noir style. The noir, like the visual noir aesthetic and style found within the classic period of film noirs. And of course, we have one more noir film to cover. Touch of Evil, directed by a familiar person, that person being Orson Welles. This was adapted from Badge of Evil, written by Whit Masterson in 1956. This was considered to be the last noir of the classic era, though this would only get the title retroactively. Its initial reception was mixed, actually finding more success in Europe than it did in America. I don't know where I was going with that train of thought. I need to read my notes better. But yes, it found more success in Europe than it did Asia. In America. Professional film historian VTuber here, chat. So, let's talk about what exactly Touch of Evil is. So this was a fictional crime-ridden, this was set in the fictional crime-ridden border town of Los Robles, where honeymooning prosecutor Miguel Vargas, Charlton Heston, takes this person right here, this lovely mustachioed individual, takes an interest in the investigation of a car bombing. The investigation is headed by a rather corrupt police captain named Hank Quinlan, who is played by Orson Welles. Yes, Orson Welles does act in his own films, and he's a pretty darn good actor. And as we see here, just more noir characteristics. You got especially this one. Sorry, I'm pointing to this scene specifically because you could mistake this for a modern film. You could mistake this for a modern film at this point. The investigator, or at least not even a modern film, but a modern crime series, with how well framed the shot is. Vargas taking his shades off as he does his interrogation of the poor suspect over here. But also, again, it's, while not exactly as urban as we think when we think of an urban space, Los Robles is still a pretty populated town. So we have that urban feeling there. We have the corrupt police officer of police captain rather, of Hank Quinlan. We have this, and most of the time there's just dark, just pure black within most of the scenes. Sometimes through shadows, sometimes through the lack of, sometimes in the sky, or lack of lighting within the sky, and many more. Even the dark clothing does wonders to help form faux chiaroscuro in a sense, like fake contrast without the use of light or lack thereof, because since you have a giant dark shape of darkness, that does affect and help create, that does help create more, what's the word, contrast, there we go, between light and shadow. And of course, since this is a Orson Welles film, bless Orson Welles for his outstanding artistic direction and camera work. All these shots are very Orson Welles-y, if that makes sense. And this is Police Captain Quinlan. This is played by Orson Welles himself. Orson Welles is, again, a very, very good actor. So again, remember too all those shots of Citizen Kane that I mentioned and how they influenced noir films, Film Noir's classic period. Here we have Orson Welles coming in at the very end of Film Noir's classic period and then making his own noir film. And essentially giving the Citizen Kane treatment aesthetically to a noir film. And it culminates in this very aesthetically beautiful film. These shots here, these three shots are common within specifically these two. My mouse wasn't on screen, my bad. Specifically these two shots with like a frame in the background, as we see here, the windows in the background. These are important shots within Welles' repertoire. These kinds of shots first came from Citizen Kane. So it's very wonderful, and it's very nice to see these shots back here. I was watching these films, I sat up and pointed. I did the DiCaprio meme. Oh my goodness, I've seen that shot before, but breaking professionalism kinda here. Oh my goodness, I saw these before. But yes, like, these are very much Orson Welles standard shots. These two shots here. If there's anything to take away from Orson Welles' aesthetics, it's these shots here. Character in the foreground, other character in the background, and maybe something else in the extreme background. Sometimes that would be another actor, sometimes that would just be like the bar sign here or the window still here. It's just a way to frame things. It is a wonderful framing device. Frame here, leading lines here. This to a lesser degree, but still very much in line with Orson Welles' camera work and common camera angles. So now that we've finally covered the Film Noir's classic period, let's talk about the price, or rather lack thereof, surrounding film noirs. It's a characteristic that I think goes unnoticed when talking about these kinds of films. These were, regardless of quality and impact, or rather, most of these were, regardless of their quality and impact, B movies at the end of the day. They were cheap to produce, and studios needed something to fill out their bundles for blockbucking. The idea that a film noir should be a B movie is not and should not be a metric as to what defines it. However, I believe it's something that should be noted. Thank you for the hydrate. However, it should be noted, as I said before. Actually, the fact that most film noirs at the time were B movies does actually allow some explanation, or rather a good explanation of why these film noirs look the way they look. They are reflective of the production practices that were allowed with such a tight budget. And because these were B movies, directors in charge of these B movies could get pretty creative and experimental with their plots under the right circumstances. What those circumstances were, you'll see very soon. I've mentioned it before, I've alluded it before during this stream, during this session, but if you know, you know. If you don't know, you'll remember very soon. So, their statuses as B movies aside, what makes a film noir a film noir? Let's start with the visuals. Of course, the standard of film noir is chiaroscuro lighting. Again, I apologize, Italians. The iconic lighting technique focusing on stark shadows. For example, and as you've seen, characters can be partially hidden in shadow, typically done for suspense and mystery. Excuse me. Another aspect of film noirs... Oh, I'm getting pretty gassy. Another aspect of film noirs is the use of angled shots, be that wide, low, or Dutch/angled shots. A Dutch angle is basically a Dutch angle is just a shot that is not shot in a straight way. This example over here, the bottommost example, is an example of a Dutch shot. It's just an angled shot, essentially. It's an angled shot, if that makes sense. These are specifically done to disorient the viewer, to foster a sense of unease through unusual angles that humans aren't normally able to perceive things from. So keep this in mind, this whole idea of disorienting viewers as an aspect of film noir, because if you go watch film noirs, you will see plenty of unnatural or unhuman shots, and it's a key characteristic. And of course, shooting practices. There are specific shooting practices that helped form film noir's aesthetic, namely location shooting. So location shooting is basically the act of shooting on location instead on sets. And there's also this idea of night for night versus day for night shooting. So what night for night shooting essentially is if it was a night scene, you would physically shoot that at nighttime. Compared to day for night is where you'd shoot a night scene at day, but you'd have to artificially make it night through some means or magic. Back in the day when there was no magical VFX, they had to do that practically. And it's this idea of night for night shooting, this practice of shooting at night for night scenes, is what made film noir. If it was a night scene and you were watching a film noir from the classic period, it was likely shot at night. So keep that in mind. And remember, it's because of these and remember, again, these are B movies. They didn't have a lot of budget to go with. So keep this in mind. They had a tighter budget. They had to be smart about their money. So keep that in mind when thinking about what makes a film noir film noir. So, stories. Stories in film noir were often convoluted, filled with moral ambiguity that assists in making everything that much more confusing. Everything is meant to be gray, not black and white. In the literal sense, not in the literal sense, but gray morally. There is no good, there is no bad. There is no good, there is no bad. Everything is in between. There is no clear line. The main goal of these narratives were to be obscured. The whole truth was meant to be hidden, or hopefully meant to be hidden until the very end. And the audience is only fed bits and pieces as the story progresses, usually in the form of flashbacks. This is another technique that obscures the narrative and most of the time, these stories are typically told, the entire plot of a film rather is told through a flashback. And because it's a flashback, it is a subjective point of view. We don't even know if the story that we're experiencing or seeing on screen is the right story, is the truth. And whether it is or isn't the truth is up to the director. And one more thing to note. Voiceovers were incredibly common, often accompanying flashbacks. These were given in first person, typically the protagonist, though third person was also common. So when you think of a typical film noir intro where it's raining, it's moody, and then you hear crime never changes, the city never sleeps, and then it's some tired, miserable detective. Yeah, that was usually done by the protagonist of the film, and that was a common trait. In fact, Double Indemnity heavily relied on voiceovers, and it stuck, and honestly it does so much. But yes, voiceovers incredibly common, and these again were typically first person, but third person was common. But most of the time when you think of a stereotypical film noir narration, it is first person through the main character's point of view. The stories of film noirs rather, were centered around crime. More often than not, it was always about crime. No surprise there. It was usually murder, with greed and jealousy as motivators, but it could change. These crime-centered stories were also filled with deceptions and lies. Betrayals, false accusations, anything to muddy the truth one way or another was the norm within these films. Investigations and investigators were also the driving force behind these stories, whether it was the main focus or simply a device to push the plot along. As I mentioned before, Double Indemnity, the main character was not a detective, but they were being investigated by a detective. So in that case, in Double Indemnity's case, it was used as a way to progress the plot, essentially. Even if the detective investigating McMurray's character, McMurray's and Stanwyck's plot, wasn't the main character, they were still there to push the story along. Unlike Stranger on the Third Floor, the main character was an investigator, even though they weren't a detective. They were still trying to find the truth. Since investigators and investigations were common, we typically experienced private investigators and detectives. These are what we typically think as the standard for film noir, but it could be anyone, as I mentioned before, willing or unwilling parties, anyone that's dragged into the mystery. Though as common as it was to have an investigator or an investigation happening, it wasn't always present in a film noir. Other plots could also revolve around heists, cons, conspiracies, affairs, and anything else considered morally dubious at the time. So, what about characters? Characters in film noir were often morally flawed to some degree, even if they were clearly the protagonist or antagonist. These characters would be individuals we could love to hate or cheer in spite of their morals. And for the protagonists, they were often alienated and bitter, often shunned because of their past or because of an event in the film. It's because of this that they're often distrustful or skeptic about the goodwill of society. Of course, key archetypes found within film noirs with hard-boiled detective, femme fatales, and corrupt people in power. Now, you're familiar with the hard-boiled detective. That detective who's always complaining, who's tired of their work, who hates the city, who says, crime's everywhere, but I still got a job to do, so they do the job. That's your hard-boiled detective. Femme fatales are obviously females who use their charm in some way, shape, or form to seduce the protagonist into doing whatever they please. Often they do so with malicious intent, either to kill, gain money, or do any other sort of crime that they're willing to do so, that they're willing to achieve, to meet their end, of course, like to meet their goals, of course. And of course, these femme fatales were often very pretty. They flaunted that a lot on screen. And as with Stanwyck's character, Dietrichson, in Double Indemnity, that became the norm for femme fatales, and that is what we consider a femme fatale these days. In short, a very beautiful but dangerous woman. That was what was associated with film noir at the time. And forevermore, of course. So, we've covered characters, we've covered stories, now let's talk about the settings. These were typically dreary urban settings. Think Chicago, New York, LA, so on and so forth. Cities were specifically chosen because they were labyrinthian in nature, and that maze-like structure helped make the world that much more confusing, claustrophobic. And also, another thing to note was industrial areas. Think train yards, docks, factories, anything that was visually complex and busy were often present within these film noirs just to add even more confusion and claustrophobia to these films. And you often think of these settings too, rail yards being a common one. When I think of a film noir, what I think of when I'm asked what I think of a typical film noir area, I usually think of a rail yard, and then sometimes a docks, and sometimes a film noir could have all of those. And again, these were complex, busy spaces, heavily industrial, much like the cities that these films took place in. And of course, the setting usually involves drug, alcohol, and vices, anything that was considered no-no, or relatively taboo at the time, and still is at the time. Places such as bars, lounges, gambling dens, so on and so forth, were common places for the plot and character to visit, and often was the place of major events. And of course, it would not be a film noir if it wasn't nighttime and or raining, usually both. Though some films don't follow this, as we'll cover very, very soon. Tone. Film noir's tone can be boiled down to one phrase: everything sucks. Or rather, the world and society sucks. These were very pessimistic films filled with people caught up in situations that they willingly or unwillingly found themselves in. And regardless of how they ended up in said situation, they would be doomed either way, no matter how hard they tried to get out of said situation. And death was pretty common in these films. The tone was reflective of post-World War II America's feelings. It was a country filled with anxieties and fears surrounding local and international issues, and noirs served as an outlet to explore these feelings. Given the states of American society at the time, these directors could essentially show anything Nope. Hey, look, remember this? It's this thing again, not you again. Oh dear, oh no, please, no. Why is it always you? But yes. Hello chat, it is the obligatory surprise Hays Code jump scare of the Box Talks. As much as I'd like to say that directors had free slate to do whatever with their film noirs, B-movie or not, they unfortunately still had to adhere to the wondrous piece of paper that is the Hays Code. If they didn't, they couldn't exhibit their pictures, and as we know, film is an industry. No matter how creative you can get, no matter how avant-garde or how conventional you may be, your main goal as a director is to make, or rather your main goal when producing a movie, aside from creating, is to, make sure you don't go broke from the process. So they had to play around these rules. In spite of the relative greatness, relative grayness of film noirs, they had to ensure that good moral conduct was upheld. Virtue had to be rewarded and vices had to be punished, which usually led to the protagonist being caught, confessing to the crimes, or killed, or maybe all three in that specific order. You never know. This did apply to any character that was morally corrupt as well, so nobody was safe. If you had a shred of anything that was considered not good moral code within the Hays Code, you were going to be punished. And of course, since there was restrictions set by the Hays Code in regards to on-screen depictions of the very vices that film noir relied upon, being murder, crime, sex, drugs, and other no-nos, they had to get very creative in portraying what they wanted to show on screen. So most of the time this would be done in shadows, through suggestions, through very creative writing from the directors, and other forms of that. So we've covered the characteristics of film noirs, we've covered the history of film noirs. Now I have something to ask you, chat, as I get another sip of water real quick. This has been plaguing me for the entire time I've been researching this. Is film noir a style or a genre? This has been bugging me to no end, and if I'm going to be honest, I still don't know. What do we think? Do we have any inklings? Is film noir a genre or style? What do we think? What do we think? Is it a genre or style? And for those who don't know, let me cover genre and style real quick. What exactly is a film genre? This is a stylistic or thematic category based on similarities in narratives, aesthetics, or emotions. Think horror, sci-fi, fantasy, so on and so forth. Not the yes. Style is defined as the cinematic techniques used by filmmakers and directors in their work. Think of Spielberg or Wells or Nolan or Quentin Tarantino, for example. Those are styles, essentially. So, with that in mind, what do we think, chat? If you had to pick one, genre or style? I'm genuinely curious, and we could talk about this after I'm done with after I'm talking about this, after this box talks, but what do you think, genre or style? What do you think? You know? What do we think? What do we think? If you had to pick one or the other, I'm kind of on the... Personally, I'm on the style. I'm just gonna put that out right now. Personally. Okay, so we have one vote for genre. Got it. Okay, so we're for one right now. Yeah, this discussion has been going on ever since film noir became a thing, and more people got eyes upon it. So don't worry if you're confused. I'm equally as confused, and that's the fun part about researching this. This is the biggest stopgap for me. So, where does film noir stand within this? Within the context of this box talks, I framed it as a genre. However, some examples I've listed aren't noirs. Citizen Kane, but those feel noir. And there are film noirs that ignore the common tropes. Remember Touch of Evil? That's essentially a small town. That is not LA, that is not Chicago, that is not New York. That is a border town. But yet, it is still a noir film, and it still has the bleak worldview, the gritty corruption, the dismal fact that someone is going to lose regardless. And those characteristics still make it a noir, even if Touch of Evil takes place in a small town relative to what we consider an urban city. So another question I'd like to pose is, does a film that used chiaroscuro lighting and weird camera angles make it a noir? Does it? Does the use of stark shadows and lighting and funny camera angles make a film noir? What do we think? What do we think? Yes, no, maybe so. Maybe 2 bagels and a cup of coffee. What are we thinking, chat? What do we think? I'm giving you some extra time to think and maybe type a reply. Yes, no, maybe so. What do we think? What do we think? I'm drum rolling mentally. What do we got? What do we got? What do we got? Probably too broad. I see you've seen through my ruse. But, yes, I purposely made it a bit too broad because it is one of the questions that I had to ask myself while looking things up. But for the sake of progressing this wonderful PowerPoint that I made, does a film that uses chiaroscuro lighting / word camera angles make a film noir? No, but it can look like a film noir. I've already talked about Citizen Kane, and I will not stop talking about Citizen Kane when prompted. But Citizen Kane is a pseudo-biopic. That is not a film noir. But it looks like a film noir, doesn't it? And another example I can point towards that looks like a film noir but isn't a noir is, of course, Casablanca. Casablanca is not a film noir. Not by any long shot. It's essentially a romance film. But aesthetically, I just ripped some scenes off of Casablanca. This looks like a film noir, doesn't it? These 2 shots over here look like a film noir, don't they? But they aren't. But Casablanca, genre-wise, is not a film noir. I'll keep this comment about Charmed and we'll talk about it afterwards, don't worry. But this is just to show that just because you have techniques that are synonymous with film noir doesn't make it a noir. However, does a film with a cynical story set in an equally cynical environment make it a noir? What do we think? Again, this is another question I'm posing to chat, because I want to hear your opinions. I want to hear them opinions, chat. What do we think? Does a film or production fall into the noir realm if it is a cynical world and a cynical story? Again, this is a very broad question, or broadly phrased question, but what do we think? What do we think? Yes, no, maybe so? Maybe 2 bagels and a coffee? What are we thinking? What do we think, chat? What do we think? Not the shrug. Boo! 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 Chat, y'all need to be more decisive. There is no right or wrong answer here, okay? We're here to foster discussion. But in my opinion, and for many's opinion, film having a cynical story set in a cynical environment does indeed make it noir. Which leads me to neo-noirs. What on earth are neo-noirs? Well, this is a film genre from the 70s onwards, taking many of the themes and characteristics we find in 40s and 50s noirs, or rather classic period noirs, for modern audiences. It carries essentially all the same characteristics found in its iteration: odd angles, harsh lighting, moral ambiguity, corruption, urban settings, so on and so forth. Everything you'd find in a film noir can be found in a neo-noir, minus the lack of color sometimes, and some neo-noir films do take more creative liberties in this regard. unlike film noirs, whose status of being a genre or style is still largely debated, many consider neo-noir as a genre and firmly established as a genre. Post-noir and neo-noir terminology is purposefully ignored by critics such as Hard-Boiled and so on and so forth. One major aspect of neo-noirs and basically any film that came after the late 1960s was that the Hays Code is gone. Praise. And in its place was actually the Motion Picture Association rating system that we all know and are familiar with. G, PG, PG-13, R, so on and so forth. So that is what replaced the Hays Code, and I'm so thankful for it because we could have so much more to depict on screen, and directors could depict the content that film noirs could not, within ratings, of course. If they still want to be PG-13, they still have to, play around the PG-13 rating, and if they wanted to stay into an R rating to avoid the A or X rating, they had to stay within the R rating. But the point is, there was so much freedom. They didn't have to skirt around regulations to depict any of the vices or messier topics that couldn't have been handled, or rather would not have been handled because of the Hays Code saying, you can't do that. And in light of this creative freedom, many neo-noirs doubled down on the cynicism of their stories and worlds. Heroes could actually lose and villains could actually win. That wasn't a thing back in the days of the Hays Code. Hi, Mudkip. Hi, Mudkip Raids. You just got at the very end of my box talks. Oh god. You're at the very end. I'm sorry. Hi. Hello, Raiders. My alerts aren't working right now, or rather my alerts are not up because I'm in the middle of teaching something. Sorry. I apologize. Anyways, enjoy my brief section about neo-noirs. Okay? I hope you like film history. Because you just walked into a classroom. I hope your stream went well. But, yes. I'm gonna start this from the top, actually. Yes, you can be excused from the test if you sit down and listen. Alright, I'm gonna rewind this from the very top of this slide. So, a major aspect of neo-noirs was that the Hays Code was gone. The Hays Code doesn't exist anymore. The funny piece of paper that said you couldn't show crime, violence, drugs, sex, or anything in an untasteful manner was gone. And in its place was the Motion Picture Association ratings, which we all know as essentially G, PG, PG-13, R-rated films, so on and so forth. And because of this removal of the dreaded Hays Code, directors were free, or rather more free, to depict whatever they wanted to, or rather depict the more grittier topics, or were able to depict all the violence, drugs, sex, and crime that they could within the ratings, of course, without fear of having to tiptoe around presenting those vices in a specific way to promote good moral conduct, as the Hays Code put it. And it was because of this freedom that there was a renewed focus on cynicism. Heroes could lose, villains could win, and under the Hays Code, you couldn't have that. Evil had to lose, and good had to be reinforced. Good question. I'll have to look into that afterwards, Ferryman. Good question, though. But, I will say, though, for the Hays Code was introduced around the 1930s, 1920s. It was a very conservative piece of document, so. And then the Hays Code eventually died out in the late 1960s, when those vices and virtues were becoming less taboo, in a sense. And back onto this focus on cynicism. Yes, you could actually lose and evil could actually win, but also, yeah, there was varying reasons for that. Sometimes it was bureaucracy. Bureaucracy sucks in some of the stories. They prevented, sometimes they prevent the case being closed, or the protagonist is stuck way in over their head. Regardless of how they presented this very dismal story, for lack of a better term, the ability to write a story where losing can be the ending is what gives neo-noirs that extra cynicism, essentially, that film noirs, or rather classic period film noirs, couldn't achieve in their time. And despite following the footsteps of film noirs, neo-noirs weren't afraid to break that mold. As time progressed, directors became more open to the idea of experimentation. Some films opted to subvert the tried and true tropes of film noirs in various ways, and some films brought entirely new or lesser used locales to the forefront, while others experimented with established archetypes. Some neo-noirs had the ability, and given the time frame of neo-noirs, post-1960s and onwards, they were able to tackle issues that film noir couldn't, or rather didn't, tackle, such as racism or queer issues. And of course, this was spurred on by changing societal views. Also, the mixing of genres comes to mind, with neo-noirs intermingling with an entirely different and unrelated genre. And of course, one such genre was cyberpunk, a mixture of sci-fi and neo-noir. And it turns out that cynicism plus anything technological and corporate works really, 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 really well. And another thing to note was that neo-noirs weren't exclusively American like most film noirs were. As if Ghost in the Shell wasn't a big indicator of that enough. They were internationally made film noirs. There were internationally made film noirs during its classic period, yes, but not to the extent that film noir was considered an international genre. Neo-noirs, on the other hand, were considered a international genre, and many were made by famous directors, some of which I'll actually cover in the next 2 slides. So, before we close this out, let's talk about some local examples of neo-noir. Chinatown, released in 1974, directed by Polanski, is one such example. Taxi Driver, directed by Scorsese in 1976, is another one. And of course, I'd be remiss not to mention Blade Runner. One of the films that brought cyberpunk up to the forefront in modern media, is also considered a neo-noir. Directed by Ridley Scott in 1982. And another one is actually LA Confidential, released in 1997. These are all neo-noirs, classified under neo-noirs, and as such, you'll see that they cover a pretty wide berth in terms of time frame. From 74 to 97. That's almost exactly a 20-year period. And this is just the local one. These are just American examples, okay? We still have to cover the international ones, and there's some really good ones here. I still need to watch some of these. And, of course, I can't cover a neo-noir film from every single country and continent. That would take up too much time, so if you want to look, if you want to find these films, you should take notes. The video will be up on YouTube, but let's close this out with some international examples. The Bad Sleep Well, directed by Kurosawa, released in 1960s, is a Japanese one, Japanese neo-noir. One from France is Alphaville, released in 1962 by Jean-Luc Godard, is another one. And for those in the Hong Kong action space, you will be happy to know that A Better Tomorrow is classified as a neo-noir. I do love me a John Woo film, I will say. We love some John Woo films in this warehouse. And another one actually coming from the Philippines, no less. Gotta rep home we gotta rep my legal aid is my motherland, even though I'm not really can't speak the mother tongue. Condemned, directed by O'Hara in 1984. And again, these are just examples. You can find other examples on the internet through IMDb. These are just handpicked by me. Because A, I've watched them, I'm familiar with the directors, or B, they're pretty darn cool. And I still need to watch more of these in my free time. If I have the free time, chat. So there you have it, folks. That is basically it. That is third session of Box Talks, where we have covered the history of film noir. Yippee! Hooray! Yes, that is basically everything I've wanted to cover for film noir. From the humble beginnings, from its influences both socially, economically, and everythingly, to the proto-noirs, any filmic inspiration, to the classic period, to defining what on earth a film noir is, and still tangling with that messy idea of either is film noir a genre or style, and of course the legacy that is neo-noirs. And we're still getting neo-noirs today, chat, by the way. We're still getting some modern neo-noirs. Many of them are, well, pretty good, I'd say. And again, if you want to find all of these films, feel free to look them up at your at your own time. This video will be, this VOD, or rather this entire presentation, will be uploaded to my YouTube, Smile. Yeah. So these will be uploaded to my YouTube. Hi. Eventually. There's my YouTube, I think. Is my YouTube there? No, my YouTube's not there. I think I disabled that command. I'm professional. But the point is, this will be up on my YouTube. So do not worry if you missed the very, very, very back, the very, like, 90% of it. If you missed 80% of it, if you missed 70% of it, if you missed 99.9% of it, or you missed 1% of it, everything will be on this entire thing will be on YouTube. So do not worry. So do not worry. So once again, this is just for the recording's sake. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for lurking. Thank you all for listening to my Box Talks. And I will see you all on the next session. And unlike what on earth I'm going to be covering, being up in the air, I will be happy to announce that I do have a actual set topic and time frame for this one. I actually scheduled this one in my head. Okay. October, spoopy month. We're gonna be talking about analog horror, okay? I'm gonna try my best to talk about analog horror in October. Film gods help me. So keep an eye out for that. So keep an eye out for that, chat. But aside from that, thank you all for listening. Thank you all for your watching, lurking, or giving the video or live stream a watch. And I'll see you again next time. This has been Azel, your local multi-dimensional interplanetary delivery box being VTuber that talks about film history whenever possible, and also does story and lore content. I'll see you all next time, okay? Take care, and bye-bye!